The moment you begin to observe yourself, truly observe, something strange starts to happen. It's not like watching a film or reviewing a memory from a safe distance. It's more like stepping into a hall of mirrors, where each reflection seems familiar, but none are quite accurate. The very act of looking inward changes what is being looked at. This is the paradox of introspection. The observer is never neutral. When you examine your conscience, you're not just uncovering buried truths or hidden motives. You're shaping them. Your gaze carries weight. The weight of past experiences, of unspoken fears, of ideals you've absorbed from the world around you. It bends the image, distorts it, sometimes beautifies what should disturb you, and sometimes condemns what simply needs compassion. Self-examination, then, is not a clean process of revelation. It's messy, subjective, and filled with illusions. Yet it's also necessary, because even a distorted mirror reveals more than the darkness of unawareness. We like to think we know ourselves, that deep down, under the noise and chaos, there's a stable self waiting to be found, something pure, unchanging, authentic. But the truth is more complex, more fluid. The self you observe is already responding to your gaze. It's adapting, performing, defending itself against judgment. As soon as you try to catch it, it shifts. Your conscience is not a fixed archive of facts and intentions. It's a living, breathing system shaped by memory, language, trauma, longing. When you sit quietly and look inward, what you find is not a clear reflection, but a conversation. A dynamic, evolving monologue where roles constantly reverse. Who is speaking? Who is listening? The one who made the choice, or the one who regrets it? The self is a layered phenomenon, and every time you peel one layer back, another emerges. Softer, stranger, sometimes more honest, sometimes more elusive. To examine yourself is to step into a house without mirrors, where every room echoes your presence in a slightly different tone. There is something unnerving about realizing that your own mind hides things from you, not out of malice, but out of protection. The unconscious doesn't shout. It whispers through hesitation, discomfort, sudden sadness with no clear cause. When you begin to examine your conscience, you don't just find answers. You awaken questions you didn't know you had. You see how often you've edited your own narrative to make life bearable. You remember things differently. You justify what once disturbed you. You forget what doesn't fit. The observer effect, when applied to the inner world, reveals a deeper vulnerability. The impossibility of total self-knowledge. We are creatures of partial truths, and perhaps that's why examining your conscience feels so heavy, because it's not just about seeing what you did, but about realizing how often you've hidden from what you've been. And yet, for all its distortions, self-observation is a kind of sacred act, not because it guarantees truth, but because it insists on honesty, or at least the pursuit of it. To sit with your own contradictions, to notice the lies you tell yourself, to feel the discomfort of your own reflection. This is not weakness. It is a form of courage. The mirror may be warped, but it still reflects something real. And sometimes, in the flicker between illusion and clarity, a deeper awareness appears, not of who you are in some final, definable sense, but of who you're becoming and what you're still hiding from. That awareness doesn't always bring peace, but it brings depth. And perhaps that is the first step, not toward certainty, but toward becoming more human, more layered, more real. Because when you look at yourself and everything trembles, that's not failure. That's the beginning. Sometimes, when you finally sit in silence and let the mind settle, you begin to hear echoes you didn't know were still there. They don't always come in words. Sometimes it's a tension in the chest, a vague unease, a flicker of a memory you thought you buried long ago. This is the strange threshold you cross when you examine your conscience deeply. You encounter guilt that was never fully acknowledged, regrets that never spoke their names. These aren't the loud, obvious guilts we carry, not the mistakes we've confessed or the apologies we've rehearsed in our heads. These are subtler, woven into the architecture of who we are. A moment you stayed silent when you should have spoken. A kindness you withheld. A truth you distorted, just enough to live with yourself. At the time, they felt small, justified, forgotten. But the conscience doesn't forget. It stores everything. Like a quiet archive, waiting for the right kind of silence to open. What's unsettling is not just the weight of what we remember, but the realization that we've lived with it this whole time. That guilt was never gone, only disguised. It hid behind productivity, behind jokes, behind the rush of daily life. We don't always feel it because we've learned to distract ourselves from it. But when we finally slow down and turn inward, we find the shadows waiting. And they're not always cruel. Sometimes they just want to be seen, not to punish, but to be honored. Because buried guilt doesn't just weigh down the soul, it shapes it. It changes how we love, how we trust, how we respond to the world. We build entire identities around what we won't admit to ourselves. And that's what makes the self so difficult to decipher. You are not just the sum of your choices. You are also the architect of your own forgetting. Some of the most haunting forms of guilt are those we rationalized at the time. The things we knew were wrong, but explained away. We tell ourselves, I had no choice. They deserved it. It wasn't that serious. But beneath every justification is a quiet knowing, a part of us that never bought the excuse. And that part waits, sometimes for years. It doesn't interrupt your life in obvious ways. It shows up in subtle self-sabotage, in the fear of being truly seen, in the restlessness that comes at night when the noise dies down. The conscience is not a courtroom. It's more like a mirror held by your own soul, one that reflects what you tried to overlook. And the most disorienting part? That mirror doesn't show you a villain. It shows you a human being, fragile, contradictory, trying to cope. And that's where the real weight comes from. Not the guilt itself, but the moment you realize you were trying to be good. And still, you fell short. But there's also something strangely beautiful about this stage of self-examination. Because when you face your hidden guilt, truly face it, you begin to feel something shift. You stop defending yourself against your own memory. You stop needing to be innocent. And in that surrender, something deeper emerges. Integrity. Not the kind that makes you flawless, but the kind that allows you to live without hiding. When you carry invisible guilt, you carry it alone. But when you acknowledge it, you step back into the shared condition of being human. Flawed, learning, trying again. Examining your conscience isn't about self-condemnation. It's about truth. And truth, however painful, always moves us closer to freedom. The weight doesn't disappear overnight, but it becomes bearable the moment you stop pretending it was never there. There comes a moment, in the act of examining your own conscience, when the process takes an unexpected turn. You begin by looking inward, thinking you're the one doing the observing. Steady, deliberate, in control. But somewhere along the way, a strange fracture appears. The one who observes begins to feel watched, as if your interior has split in two. A self that watches and a self that is being watched. The illusion of a single unified I begins to dissolve. You ask yourself, who is the real me? Is it the voice asking the question or the voice answering it? Is it the part that feels guilt or the part that tries to understand it? What you encounter here is not madness. It's a deeper truth of the human condition. We are not one voice, but a chorus. And often, those voices contradict each other, pulling us in opposite directions, making the search for authenticity feel like trying to find silence inside a storm. This fragmentation isn't new. It has lived quietly beneath the surface all along. In our indecisions, our conflicting desires, our moral hesitation. But when you slow down enough to witness it, it becomes undeniable. You realize there is a part of you that wants to be good, and another that fears being exposed. A part that longs for connection, and another that pushes others away. A part that tells the truth, and one that edits reality to preserve a certain image. To examine the conscience is to stand at the center of these contradictions and see them for what they are. Not flaws, but facts of existence. We are, by nature, divided. And yet, in this fragmentation, there is the beginning of something profound. A deeper awareness, a broader perspective. To see yourself as multiple is not to lose your mind, but to expand it. The self is not a singular entity waiting to be discovered. It's a constellation of parts, memories, instincts, and roles. And only by seeing each part clearly can we begin to understand the whole. This inner division can feel like a crisis. How can we make choices when we don't even know which part of us is choosing? How can we trust ourselves when different parts of the self want different things? These questions strike at the root of identity, and they can shake you. But they also reveal a deeper strength. Because once you stop demanding that yourself be singular and consistent, you begin to see life differently. You make peace with contradiction. You start to listen, not just to the loudest part of you, but to the quiet voices too. The wounded ones, the exiled ones, the ones that speak in shame or longing. Carl Jung once suggested that wholeness, not perfection, is the goal of the soul. And maybe this is what that means. Not to silence the inner conflict, but to honor it, to live with it, to let each part have a voice, even if they never fully agree. In this way, self-examination becomes less about finding answers and more about making space for the entire spectrum of who you are. What emerges from this fragmentation, paradoxically, is a deeper form of unity. Not the unity of simplicity, but of complexity held together by awareness. The observer and the observed are no longer enemies, but participants in an ongoing dialogue. You are not just the mistakes you regret, nor the ideals you strive for. You are the space between them, the field in which they meet. And when you can hold that space without rushing to fix it, something transforms. You become more real. Not because you've resolved your contradictions, but because you've stopped pretending they don't exist. And in that moment, the inner observer no longer distorts. It reveals. Not a perfect self, but a conscious one. And that, in a world of masks and performances, is a radical act. To be aware of your own fragmentation and to keep looking inward anyway. That is the beginning of inner integrity. Not wholeness as purity, but wholeness as presence. After the storm of guilt and the disorientation of inner fragmentation, a quiet but powerful impulse often arises, the longing to change. Not just to understand oneself better, but to become someone different, more whole, more honest, more at peace. This is the point where introspection shifts from contemplation to transformation. You've seen the truth, or at least a version of it, and now the question lingers. What will you do with what you've found? The desire for redemption isn't always dramatic. It can begin subtly, in the urge to apologize, in the decision to break a harmful pattern, in the refusal to keep living in ways that betray your deeper values. There is something sacred in this impulse. It means the conscience is not only a judge, but a guide. It's not there to imprison you in shame, but to call you back to something more authentic. Redemption, in this sense, is not about perfection. It's about alignment. bringing your actions closer to your truth. And truth, once seen, demands response. It rarely lets us remain still. You begin to notice where your life contradicts your inner knowing. You recognize the people you've hurt, the parts of yourself you've neglected, the compromises you've made in the name of comfort. And this recognition isn't just mental. It lives in the body, in the weight behind your sighs, the heaviness in your steps, the restless need to set things right. But the path to redemption is not linear. It's filled with resistance. The same ego that once defended your illusions now fears what change might cost. What if you lose people? What if you fail again? What if you're not strong enough to become who you're trying to be? These are real fears, and they echo through the conscience like unanswered questions. But still, the pull toward redemption persists. Because something in you, perhaps the deepest part, knows that to live without alignment is to live in exile from yourself. And no comfort is worth that price. This is where many spiritual and philosophical traditions quietly meet, in the idea that awareness alone is not enough. The examined life must eventually become the changed life, not out of obligation, but out of necessity. Because once you've seen the dissonance between who you are and who you want to be, staying the same becomes a kind of spiritual dishonesty. Redemption, then, is not about erasing the past. It's about creating a future where you no longer betray what you've come to understand. It's not always heroic. Often, it's ordinary. Choosing patience where you once chose control. Speaking truth where you once stayed silent. Letting go of the mask, even when it still feels safer to wear it. These actions don't erase guilt. They transmute it. They turn the pain of self-awareness into the power of self-direction. And in that turning, something begins to heal. Not in a loud, triumphant way, but like a wound that stops bleeding simply because it has finally been touched with care. And perhaps this is the quiet miracle of redemption, that it doesn't require you to become someone else. It simply asks you to return to who you were before you started hiding, before the excuses, before the fear, before you learned to protect yourself by becoming a stranger to your own soul. To redeem yourself is not to undo what has been done. It is to reclaim what was lost in the process. The ability to live with integrity, to act in alignment with what you now know to be real. And though the path is steep, it is also luminous. Because the moment you begin to act from that deeper place, the place your conscience brought you to, life takes on a different texture. It becomes less about appearances and more about essence. Less about being right and more about being true. And in that shift, you begin to feel it. Not the comfort of being perfect, but the peace of being honest. That is where redemption begins. Not in grand gestures, but in quiet revolutions. One choice at a time. When you've walked through the corridors of your own conscience, seen the buried guilt, felt the fracture of your identity, wrestled with the desire for redemption, you may expect some grand reward at the end. A radiant clarity, perhaps. A triumph of will or spirit. But what actually arrives is much stranger, much quieter. It is a stillness that almost frightens you. A calm that feels unfamiliar, like a room you've never dared enter now standing wide open. It is not the kind of peace sold in self-help mantras or found in fleeting moments of pleasure. This is a deeper thing. The kind that arrives when there's nothing left to run from. You're no longer trying to prove your worth or hide your failures. You're simply here, aware of all that you are and all that you are not, and somehow that is enough. The mind, once a battlefield, now becomes a quiet lake, still reflecting your image, still imperfect, but no longer distorted by denial. This strange peace isn't warm or euphoric. It doesn't lift you up. It grounds you. It teaches you how to stand without armor, how to live without illusion. In its presence, there are no grand epiphanies, only a gentle unraveling of all the noise you used to mistake for selfhood. You don't become someone new. You become real. And that realness, raw and unpolished, is more liberating than any mask you've ever worn. You begin to see that peace doesn't come from fixing yourself, but from ceasing to flee from yourself. The void you feared, the silence beneath your thoughts, no longer threatens to consume you. It becomes your home, not because it's comfortable, but because it's honest. And in that honesty, a new kind of freedom blooms. The kind that doesn't need explanation. The kind that doesn't beg for validation. You have seen yourself, truly, and you did not look away. That alone is an act of radical freedom. What changes in this space isn't just your inner landscape, but your relationship to the world. You stop demanding that others complete you or confirm your story. You stop performing for approval. Stop bending to fit the shape others want from you. There's a quiet confidence now. Not arrogance, but rootedness. You know who you are, and more importantly, who you are not pretending to be. You can carry your contradictions without shame. You can admit your past without being trapped by it. This freedom is not about liberation from responsibility, but liberation from illusion. And because of that, your compassion grows. You begin to see others not through the lens of judgment or competition, but through the recognition that they too are fractured, struggling, trying to become real. The peace you carry is not only for you, it becomes a space you offer. A stillness that invites honesty. A presence that makes others feel less alone in their own becoming. And so the observer effect completes its quiet revolution. You looked inward and were changed. Not through force, not through will, but through the slow undoing of all the falsehoods you once clung to. This peace, the one that arrives after the void, is not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new way of being. One where self-awareness is no longer a burden, but a companion. One where you no longer need to escape your conscience because you've learned to walk beside it. Life doesn't become easier. The world remains unpredictable, often cruel, but you move through it differently. Not immune, but intact. And that, perhaps, is the ultimate transformation. Not that you became perfect, but that you became whole. Fragmented, yes, but fully inhabited. There is no applause here, no final victory. Only the quiet dignity of someone who dared to see themselves and lived to tell the truth of it. That is the peace. That is the freedom. That is where life, honest and undivided, begins again.